up guys, Otterpop here and welcome to another Dan vs. review. This is the review for Season 1, Episode 15, Dan vs. Art. So, quick recap of the episode. Actually, before I go for the recap, quick mention that the link to the actual reaction is going to be down in the description below, but this is the review, which starts off with a recap, and the recap is, when his car is turned into an art piece, Dan vows revenge on the man who started it all, Art Artstein, and I wish I was kidding about that name, but yeah, that's his name. You know, this episode, for one particular reason, really hit home for me, but I'll get onto that a little bit later, because one of the first things I kind of want to talk about is Chris's style, because obviously there's plenty of mention of art in this particular episode, and of course, you know, Chris is implied to have a sort of tacky sense of style, which, I mean, I'm not terribly surprised. I mean, just look at his personality. He's oblivious, he's passive, he's lazy, also chill kind of at the same time, but given all those characteristics, I'm not very surprised that he has a very tacky sense of style, whether it comes to clothing, art, the like. You know, he considers a painting of a flower that's saying good morning and have a great day to be, you know, classy, when it's clearly fairly tacky, as Elise says. And I mean, Elise, you would kind of know, like, she seems to have a little bit of a sense of style. She likes a sort of farm and field painting, which, you know, matches the carpet and the drapes somewhat. I mean, I haven't really gotten a good look at the carpet and drapes, but I mean, I guess it kind of matches it somewhat. So at least she seems to have a little bit of a sense of style and probably is a lot more classy than Chris. But Chris apparently can't even tell art from food. That's how much he likes food, apparently, because he ate a plastic apple pie and half of a plastic burger without even realizing that he was even eating plastic to begin with. And in a previous episode, Dan vs. Ye Olde Shakespeare Dinner Theater, he ended up eating soap soup, and even after knowing what it was, he still continued to eat it. So, like I said, I think in a previous reaction and/or review, Chris's tongue is clearly broken, seriously. Even so, by the end of the episode, Chris seems capable of learning a thing or two, like, you know, learning a little bit more about art. Like, he starts to finally realize, for one thing, that, you know, Impressionism is just realism with light. Also, like, you know, rapid brush strokes, and plenty of artists who were starting to do Impressionist art, you know, basically throwing away traditional painting methods and whatnot. But at least Chris seems capable of learning, so okay, I guess there's that. It was kind of funny for the longest time, and I was absolutely agreeing with Dan and Elise on multiple points relating to this, but clearly Chris does seem to have a very tacky sense of taste and can't even, and it's constantly joked of throughout the episode, and with Chris even saying it himself, that he can't tell the real art or good art from bad art or something like that, but a little bit more on that pretty soon. Chris's tacky sense of style is one thing, but there were other things that were kind of, you know, seen or mentioned throughout the entirety of the episode, at least pertaining to other topics, like the specific topic of Mr. Mumbles. This was definitely, okay, not a Mr. Mumbles-centric episode necessarily, but I immediately noticed right off the bat how much more screen time Mr. Mumbles had compared to a lot of previous episodes. Again, even before the title card came up, like, you know, Mr. Mumbles had plenty of screen time. This was like a true formal next appearance of this character after Animal Shelter. Like, he'd been seen a couple times on screen and off screen, but like for just a few brief seconds. But this time, you know, Dan was actually talking specifically to Mr. Mumbles and, you know, about to give him a bath and stuff like that. It was absolutely adorable. And of course, Dan got a whole bunch of scratches on his back. I can semi-get that, you know, living with, you know, two cats myself. And it was also really adorable seeing the relationship between Mr. Mumbles and Dan. Like, and Mr. Mumbles even, you know, retrieved Dan's favorite lighter later on in the episode. And it's like, oh, that's freaking adorable. I was clearly noticing the two of them, like, it was hard to tell if they were necessarily bonding or just, you know, this was just the first, like, real sign of their relationship that maybe had been in previous instances off-screen or something like that. I don't know, but it was adorable seeing the two of them together and, like, you know, seeing Dan caring so much for Mr. Mumbles. It was absolutely cute. But of course, Mr. Mumbles getting a little bit more screen time only makes sense if the character is going to be a lot more prominent in the episode, and indeed he is, or should I say, indeed she is. That is right, Mr. Mumbles is actually a Miss Mumbles. Mr. Mumbles is actually a girl! I was shocked and ecstatic when I heard that. I was like, it didn't really change my perception of the character in any way, but it was just like, oh, but it was assumed that the cat was a male character the whole time, but now it's a female character. What? I mean, again, it doesn't change too much about the character, but it was still kind of fun and exciting to learn about. The circumstances of learning about it were a little bit questionable, but learning about it was still nonetheless very exciting. So I don't care whatever the frick Dan might say in the future, I will be calling this character Miss Mumbles from now on. I decided immediately that I was going to, from this point on, call the character Miss Mumbles. And I didn't even care. I didn't care, like I said in the reaction, I didn't care if Dan was going to keep calling it Mr. Mumbles, or maybe call it Miss Mumbles, or maybe just Mumbles, or, you know, maybe it was actually a girl when it was supposed to be a boy. I don't know. It didn't matter, because the character would forever, from then on, be Miss Mumbles. So for one, we learned a little bit more about Chris. Well, I mean, not too much more. We know that he has a tacky sense of style, but also that he can learn a little bit more, so maybe it's not quite as tacky anymore, but maybe it will be brought up in future episodes, maybe it won't. But we also learned a little bit more about Miss Mumbles. Again, Miss Mumbles from now on. It's going to be Miss Mumbles. I'm not going to call her Mr. Mumbles anymore. It's always going to be Miss Mumbles. But there was a third thing that I definitely wanted to talk about. I mean, in addition to the random miscellaneous stuff I noticed throughout the episode. But the third big thing, obviously, is all the crazy kinds of modern art parodies and jokes and riffs and whatever you want to call them. Oh, but this was a little bit of a tough episode for me. More on that later, but it's a little bit of a joke that pieces of modern art can just be seen as metaphors regardless of medium and tools used. Like, I don't understand why people see a metaphor or whatnot in any kind of art, whether it's really good, whether it's weird, whether it's trash, I don't know. For some reason, like, there's a lot of modern art that people will, like, see as metaphors. I don't fully understand it. I do in some cases, but I don't fully understand it in other cases, because art can be seen in many ways and can have many forms of expression, unless it really just doesn't make any sense or is just straight up trash. And, you know, Dan thinks art is supposed to be priceless. Like, there are plenty of people that it's like, oh, art is supposed to be priceless. But that's not entirely true. Again, that's a little bit of a joke and a parody in of itself, because some art is worth a lot. Like, depending on the age of the artwork, the artist, the medium used. Like, you know, an oil painting made by Monet in the 1800s could be seen as worth quite a bit of money. Because, you know, his style was just incredible. Sorry. I mentioned Monet in my reaction, but I mention it again because I saw Monet exhibits some months ago with my parents because I love art. I love art to a great degree. Some modern art, but especially some, like, you know, the realists, the impressionists, some of the older abstract artists. Oh, so good. Sorry, off tangent. But yes, some art may be worth a lot and may be considered priceless by a lot of people. Some art is worth a little bit, but it may be worth more to others, depending on, you know, maybe if they're the artist or friends or family of the artist, or they just, you know, consider that particular kind of style to be worth a lot and the rest of the styles in existence to be like, meh, kind of thing. Like, it's... I'm actually going to get onto that later. But then there's also some art that's just worth trash. That's worth literal trash. Like, it's just, like, you know, it's just done to be done, but it's not really worth a lot. Again, it's all very different. And even Chris saying at one point in the episode that he doesn't know how to tell the good art from the bad. And, you know, lots of people really can. But in a strange twist, no one really can. Like, no one person can tell what art is good and what art is not. And I'm gonna say this a little bit later as well, I imagine, but it's all in the eye of the beholder. But again, a little bit more on that later. Even later on in the episode, after Dan and Chris completely ruin Art Artstein's work by, you know, with all kinds of spray paint and ripping up some of the paintings, it's still considered valuable art. Like, valuable as in it can be sold for a decent amount of money. Enough that art is like, yes, and this is all on sale. Like, really? A conceited piece of shite if you ask me. But it's like, if you make an artwork, you spend so much time working on it, only to have it ruined by assholes like Chris and Dan. Like, that would tick me off. But, and it probably wouldn't even consider to be valuable anymore. But even after it's ruined, or I guess not ruined, or changed in a weird way, it's still considered valuable. And then the claim that art is supposed to have meaning, but it doesn't always, but it does have different meanings for different people. I mentioned this in my reaction specifically, but I specifically said that art is basically a way of expression to convey either what I said was a subject, an emotion, or a story. Like, subject isn't, a specific, person or object or place or something like that. Or an emotion, like, using specific colors or techniques or places or certain art styles to convey, happiness, sadness, depression, loneliness, anger. And yes, there are plenty of artists out there that do convey very negative or strong emotions in their art. It's actually fairly common, or maybe a story, like some of the comics out there. I've been doing a wolf comic myself for a long time, so I'm trying to convey mostly a story. But those are usually the three big things that art is made, is to express yourself and convey a subject, emotion, or story. Those are usually the three biggies. There are obviously a bunch of other ones, maybe some subgenres or subfields of subjects, I guess you could say, of what you're trying to convey through art, but those are definitely the three big ones that I usually tend to notice either in my own art or other artists' art. Again, it sometimes seems like there's a common misconception that art is supposed to have meaning, and it doesn't always, but it can also have different meanings to all different kinds of people. Like I said earlier, it's all in the eye of the beholder. That's the biggest thing. Like, sometimes there's some of these amazing abstract pieces that I will look at, and I'll be like, these are so good that you can literally get opinions from 10 different people, and they'll probably all be different in terms of what they see or what they feel or anything. Like, there are so many different kinds of art that can give off different ideas, different emotions, different feelings, different experiences or stories, anything of the sort. But it's all in the eye of the beholder, because every person is different. We all create art in different ways, but we also see art in different ways as well. That's just humans. Different experiences lead all of us to see the world in very different ways. How we're raised leads us to see the world in very different ways, and that in turn can lead every individual to seeing different art pieces, different art styles and subjects in very different ways from, say, another individual who has lived in a completely different country and has been raised a completely different way, grown up on different foods, customs, cultures, religion, whatnot. But we all see everything in a different way, including art. That's what makes it so interesting. Well, that's what makes art so interesting in my opinion. I said earlier that this episode kind of hit home for me in a lot of different ways, the biggest reason being that I'm an artist myself, so I really identified with a lot of the jokes and references and parodies going on, but I also identified with a lot of the information and the ideas that were kind of thrown into this episode. But it was also weird because this episode was a really rare one where I was caught in a complete crossroads throughout the entirety of the episode. I was going back and forth between, having my own opinions on the matter, but also agreeing with Dan and or Chris and or Elise on some cases. Again, it was throughout the entirety of the episode that I was like, I agree with this, but I have my thoughts on this. I mean, I kind of see where you're going with this. No, but I have my own thoughts on this matter too. The inciting incident was Dan's car getting artsified by Art Artstein, and I agreed with Dan a little bit in that, seeing my car in that kind of state would probably get me a little bit pissed off initially, but then I would be like, yeah, it's kind of cool. But then I would go back to being pissed off, and then I would just probably go back and forth. That's honestly how much I love art. As ticked off as I would be, if I saw something that cool or even cooler on my freaking car, I'd be like, on the fence. I don't know how to feel about this. And speaking of, his car even becoming art in the first place, the idea that, anything can be art, and it's like, yeah, I mean, anything can be art, I don't necessarily disagree with that, but that doesn't mean everything can be art, and that also doesn't mean everything should be art. There's a little bit of a limit, legally or otherwise, where you can't necessarily turn anything you want into art. Again, anything can be art, doesn't mean everything should be art. Dan later mentioned on in the episode, saying something along the lines of, abstract art looks like somebody just threw up on the canvas, and yeah, sometimes it can. That's kind of what abstract art can be in a sense. It's almost what it is, but also what it isn't. It again, depends on the eye of the beholder. But like I've said before, sometimes abstract art is just so good that everyone can interpret it completely differently, whether it's the intention or not. If it is the intention, brilliant. If it's not the intention, maybe accidentally brilliant? I don't exactly know, but Dan clearly knows very little about art, like abstract, impressionist, realist, or cartoony or otherwise. Like, clearly he knows very little. It's plainly obvious. Chris did not know very much for the longest time, but that was kind of rectified near the end of the episode. But, like, yeah, abstract art does kind of look like that. It looks like somebody threw up on the canvas. Sometimes. It kind of depends on the artist and their style. But not all of it looks like that. Sometimes it can, but not always. And I even said at one point during the reaction about how, art is complex, but not complex all at the same time. It's all in the eye of the beholder. It's all what they see in the artwork, whether it's the artist themselves, or a consumer, or just a viewer who's just looking at all kinds of random art pieces, but it's all in the eye of the beholder. If you think about it, Dan is in a piece of artwork himself. Like, TV shows are considered to be art in their own way, especially with it being a combination of, an animated cartoon style mixed with the characters, the designs. Even sometimes the humor in the script can be considered art as well, but like, in a weird way, Dan is part of an art piece himself. It's just a long animated piece. So, take that, Dan. Just take it. As often as I said no to you throughout this episode, as often as I, might have disagreed with you, I also agree with you sometimes. Again, I was on this weird fence for a long period of the episode, and especially as I was rewatching it, I'm like, yeah, I can see where you're coming from, but also I can't see where you're coming from. Also, I have my own opinions on the matter, so I'm going to share them whether you like me to or not. Because, again, art is a big part of my life. It has been for a really long time. I didn't even think I would ever become an artist, and I'm not even a professional. I'm not really an amateur necessarily, but I'm still a hobbyist artist. Like, I do it for fun. It's something that I do for myself. Maybe I'll do commissions at some point. I don't exactly know. But again, I do art for me. Like, of course, I do share with other people, and it's nice to see that other people appreciate the kinds of things that I draw, whether it's realistic or cartoony in nature. I mean, usually my style is pretty semi-realist in a way. But yeah, art is just such a big part of my life. It has been for a very long time, and, this episode really stood out to me because of that. And it probably might not have to a lot of people there, but there were so many parodies and jokes and references and riffs and whatnot that I got kind of right off the bat, or that I got immediately after rewatching the episode without having to look up any, background information on the episode at all. Like, this episode just really stuck out to me because it's something I'm very familiar with, because it's something I very much identify with in my own way. But enough of a rant of me going on about art. I wouldn't be surprised if this was going to be like the longest review I've ever done, because again, art means a lot to me. But I still have a few little random miscellaneous things to talk about, little things that happen throughout the course of the episode. So, I mean, one thing was that the Dan hole that was made in Chris's and Elise's wall, which is kind of why they initially wanted to get a painting in the first place. I think the incident as to why it was created has something related to jetpacks, and initially that sounded kind of crazy to me, but as soon as I heard it again, I'm like, wait, wasn't there a previous episode where he tried to make a homemade jetpack or something like that? I think it was maybe the traffic episode where he tried to make a homemade jetpack so we could just fly over traffic without issue, but obviously failed, and I don't even know how I remember that detail, but maybe my memory's getting better, maybe that's it. A brief mention on Dan's lack of intelligence is when he tried to bribe somebody with a sandwich and a bag of chips. A bag of ruffled chips. But he still tried to bribe somebody with that. Seriously, Dan, you think that's what people go for nowadays? I mean, maybe hobos and homeless people do, but really? He thinks that, people who work, for an art school or in the business industry or whatever kind of industry are going to go for that kind of bribe? Dan's intelligence really does astound me, but that was the only major thing that I really noticed. I mean, obviously he's got his, smart and sort of dumb moments throughout the episode, like he does for most, but that was the only thing that really stuck out to me in terms of his intelligence, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. There are plenty of episodes in the past where I've talked exclusively about my questioning of his intelligence, especially in George Washington, but that's mostly because there was an explanation given that time. Like in the Canada episode, Chris clearly has some impressive strength. First, he was able in Dan vs. Canada to hoist a bear and Dan onto his shoulders and cross a river without too much effort. I mean, he's also half bear, so maybe that's part of it, I don't know. But in this episode, he was able to pull up a rope with Dan and a hobo. I think that's how he's just referred to. But Dan and a hobo, and he was just able to pull them up with a rope onto the top of a building, so clearly he's got some decent strength. I don't know about stamina, because he was clearly tired after pulling them up the entirety of the building, but I don't know. I mean, he does have a decent amount of strength. Probably not the best stamina, but it's kind of hard to tell. He still surprises me from time to time. And speaking of the hobo man reappears! He's been seen a couple of times already. I think in, I don't think it was Animal Shelter. No, it was Animal Shelter. It was definitely Animal Shelter, but I know he's appeared in another episode, maybe two? I can't exactly remember for sure, but Animal Shelter definitely. But he's a very interesting character. He's a very wacky and zany character. He is clearly paranoid. He thinks aliens are coming for him. That much is shown in this particular episode. I think it was the Animal Shelter episode when Chris was KO'd in a bus stop, or at least a bus in general, and I think the hobo was asking Dan, do you want, or like, are you doing anything with that body? Like, I immediately like was thinking, necrophiliac, but then I was like, no, I'm not gonna go that far, but I'm having to go that far. Because apparently somebody might be a little bit into bestiality, which I kind of suspected. I didn't really say anything about, but I mean, this show has been known to take chances from time to time. Either I just don't notice it in most other cartoon shows, or this show really does like to take chances. Like, it's been implied that this guy's a necrophiliac as well as, you know, somebody into bestiality, and if you don't know what it is, look it up because I'd rather not explain it. Because, I mean, the hobo guy identified Miss Mumble's gender under suspicious circumstances. Like, it's a little bit cringe to think about. Like, he's an interesting character, but man, does this show like to take chances. Chances I never saw coming. Like, what? I'm gonna stop right there before I freak out too much more, so that's literally all I have to say about this episode. Sorry if this review went a little bit longer than most, but I have my rants, so don't judge. Just don't judge. Some episodes will hit, again, art is kind of like, you know, these episodes and these reviews in general. Every episode, every topic will hit different people in different ways. This one just happened to hit me a lot stronger than a lot of the previous episodes so far, so that's the biggest reason. So thank you all for watching. I hope you guys have enjoyed the reaction as well as the review, and as usual, until the next video guys, check you laters.